Hello, everyone, and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I want to thank you for joining me here today for episode number 338. Today, I'll be sharing with you a conversation I had with Terri Daniel on the Ask Dr. Death podcast, which is a podcast primarily started by Terri, but I'm a sometimes co-host with her on that podcast. And we recorded a conversation with one another where we talk about lots of different things, but each one of us tells our stories in a way on how we got started doing the work that we're doing. So I thought you might enjoy listening in on that conversation. And one thing I wanted to say is on this podcast, I tend to be somewhat conflict avoidant. I'm a little bit averse to controversy. And so I try to stay away from asserting strong opinions. But one thing I love about Terri is that she doesn't hold back. She doesn't have any of the fears that I have and the sensitivities about topics that we talk about. And so Terri amazes me because she's willing to go into tough subjects and have difficult conversations with people far more than I am. And so that's one thing that makes Ask Dr. Death a really interesting podcast to listen to. So I thought you'd appreciate knowing about it. And if you'd like something with a little bit different flavor than you get here on End of Life University, you might enjoy adding Ask Dr. Death to your list of podcasts. So I'll be sharing that in just a moment. But I have a couple of announcements. First of all, today, as this podcast airs, is Valentine's Day. And I want to acknowledge that this is a really difficult day for people who are grieving because they see other people celebrating love after facing the death of someone they love. And when I come back after this conversation with Terri, I'm going to tell you about an app called Grief Coach that I've been using personally. I'll give you more information about that, but I have found a tremendous amount of value in it. And so I'm excited to tell you about it, but stay tuned after the interview with Terri, and then I'll come back on and give you some more information about Grief Coach. But it's something that can help people get through difficult holidays like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays, other anniversaries. So that'll be coming up too, right after my interview with Terri. And then one final announcement, I want to thank my two latest supporters on Patreon, Monica Kanuska and Katarina Mack. And again, my apologies if I've mispronounced your names at all. But my big announcement is with those two additional patrons coming on to add support for the podcast, we've met our goal to be able to provide transcripts. So starting with next week's episode, I will be able to pay for transcripts for each episode. For those of you who've been asking about how to read along with the podcast. So starting next week, we'll be offering transcripts. So I'm really excited about that. And I want to thank all of you who stepped up to help support the podcast through my page at patreon.com/EOLU. You've made it possible for me to add on this additional service. So I'm really grateful to you. So now we'll move on to my conversation with Terri Daniel, again for Ask Dr. Death podcast. Here we go.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Terri Daniel, and I am here with my buddy and podcast partner, Dr. Karen Wyatt, for a special little episode we decided to put together, which is just for the purpose of introducing ourselves to you and to talk a little bit about our work and who we are and what we do and why we do this. So I am Terri, and this is Karen.
Hi, Terri. I'm your occasional, sometimes co-host on the podcast because you do the bulk of the work for this podcast. I just show up every now and then.
Well, that's because you have another podcast that takes up most of your time. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I have two other podcasts now. I have End of Life University, which I've been doing for 7 years now. And so I do interviews there with people who work in all areas around end of life, and partly just to learn from them about what they do and why they do what they do, and just to be able to share it with people who are uncomfortable thinking and talking about death, so they can hear two people who aren't uncomfortable, who enjoy talking about death. So, and then another podcast I started is called What Really Matters. And there I just talk about spiritual issues that come up around the end of life, but also things I'm dealing with in my own life, spiritual issues I'm working on, like forgiveness and love and learning how to be in the present moment, things like that.
And you also have a book called What Really Matters.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's been republished as 7 Lessons for Living from the Dying, but What Really Matters was the original title.
It's a great title. Well, I hope you sell lots of books. And I'm so happy to talk to you about this, because we've talked about so many things over the years, but we've never really shared with our listeners like a little bit of our own personal story. And so why don't you start with, I don't know, wherever you want to start, why you decided to become a doctor and then later went into hospice doctoring.
Yeah, I had, ever since I was a little child, I imagined myself being a nurse. And I don't know why, but every time in kindergarten, even, I drew a picture of myself as a nurse in a hospital. And so I don't know where that came from exactly, but I got inspired by my 4th grade teacher to think about being a doctor. And she said, you know, women can be doctors too. And at 12, I decided that's what I would do. I wanted to be a doctor. So I had the goal for a long time. And at some point along the way, I was a really weird child.
Me too. Imagine that.
You know, I climbed up in trees and read books all the time and spent a lot of time by myself. But I got this notion when I was 16 that love is what life is really about. And again, I don't know where that came from. It was in my mind that love is really what we're here for. So I wanted to be a doctor, and I knew that love was important. So I decided I would be a doctor who would love my patients, and that was what my life was about and what I was here for, which sounds very crazy when you go to a Western medical school and tell people that.
How old were you when you decided this?
When I was 16.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, so I ended up finally in medical school on the first day of school telling everyone that I believe that love is actually what heals people. It's the healing energy, and that I'm becoming a doctor because I want to help people, but I think that love is the best way to do that. And suddenly looked around the room and realized everyone here thinks I'm completely crazy.
Right. They all ran away from you. Nobody wanted to sit next to you or eat lunch with you.
So right away I learned never say anything like that again in the company of medical professionals, because it made no sense to anyone else. But I carried that with me, this idea that somehow I know that love is really important. If we honestly want to help people, we have to be capable of love. So I was always working on that within myself. Like, what patients do I find it hard to love? Who don't I love? And why don't I love them? And how do I learn how to love them? Which was a really interesting practice to have. But anyway, about 3 years into my medical practice, as I trained as a family medicine doctor, so taking care of the whole spectrum of life from birth to death. 3 years into my medical practice, my father died by suicide. And that was devastating to me in every way, as you can imagine. I mean, as a daughter dealing with my dad's death, but also as a doctor who believes in the power of love, because my dad was one of the people I loved the most in the world. And my love did nothing to help him or to save him. You know, he took his own life. So that completely shattered like everything I had believed. It shattered even my confidence as a doctor. I wondered if I should be a doctor still. Am I any good at being a doctor? And this love theory I had didn't make sense anymore. And I really was in a desperate state of grief and guilt at that point. And that would happen to anyone who has a loved one dying by suicide, the guilt in particular, and wondering why I couldn't fix it. But I think it was worse for me because I was a doctor and I had extra training in psychology. I did a 1-year fellowship in psychiatry, and I worked with lots of patients who had depression and suicidal thoughts. So just my inability to help my dad really made me question myself down to the very depths. So I went into a very deep spiral of grief for about 3 years. Everything seems to happen in these 3-year time frames. But at one point, one day, I got this idea in my head to call hospice. And because I had no training whatsoever throughout my medical school or residency in anything dealing with end of life or death and dying, I honestly wasn't even sure what hospice did. I knew it had something to do with death, but I didn't even know what
and you
hospice
were
did.
still in medical school at this point?
No, I was in practice. I had my own practice with patients. And I did, I knew hospice had something to do with death. I didn't know what, but the idea came in my head, like, that's what you need to help with this grief. This is your way to deal with grief. You have to call hospice and start volunteering for them if they take volunteers. So that day I called our local hospice. I didn't even know if we had a hospice in our community. That's how little I knew. But I looked it up in the yellow pages that we used to use back in the past and found a hospice. I called them and said, I don't know if you take volunteers. I don't know what you do, but I'm a doctor and I would be interested in volunteering if I could help you in any way. And the woman on the phone line, who was the director of the program on the other end of the phone, said, "What made you call us right now?" And I said, "I don't know." I don't know why I'm calling you. And she said, "Because our medical director just resigned 30 minutes ago.
Oh my God.
She said, we've been in a panic trying to figure out how we're going to operate because we have to have a doctor. We have to have a medical doctor to sign off on everything." And she said, "And then you call us." She said, "It's like a miracle." And I'm sitting there going,
wow.
But wait, what is it that you do again? Like, what is hospice again? And she said, "We would love for you to become our medical director." I went down there that day, learned a lot about what hospice does. I just became their volunteer medical director. But so I had to get lots and lots of training to even understand how to help patients at the end of life and learn about death and dying. But right away, I recognized this is where I need to be. This is the kind of medicine that I wanted to practice all along, where I can bring love to these patients and I can sit with them. I can be at the bedside. I can bring everything I have to offer and be my whole self, including my grieving, guilt-laden, wounded self, and be in this setting with these patients and still be of service. And so right away, I knew, like, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. And ultimately, I quit my other medical practice and just did hospice full time.
So you volunteered. You didn't get paid at first, but eventually they hired you.
Yeah, eventually I got hired. We were a small nonprofit hospice in the beginning that sold out to a for-profit company, and they walked in the door with money and said, "We'll pay you if you'll work full time." So that's what I did.
How many years ago was this?
So this was a long time ago now, 30 some years ago now that I started in hospice. So,
you brought up a really good point. And I've been in hospice now, starting also as a volunteer for about 14 years. And almost everybody I meet who works in hospice is there because of their own grief. It really is a place to go with unresolved grief or resolved grief, any kind of grief.
Yeah. One thing that was helpful to me was to recognize, like, oh, this is something everyone has to deal with, because dealing with suicide for me, I'd never known anyone else who was struggling with the suicide death of a loved one. And I felt so isolated and alone, but suddenly in the midst of hospice, it's like all we talk about all day is death and dying and grief. And it's like, oh, this is part of life. And that was the first thing that came to me was, I'm not strange or unusual. It's part of life to go through this pain and this grief. And the second thing I recognized is that when you have like that, what I'd been doing earlier in my grief process was every day I would wake up and think, someday I'm going to go back to the way things were before Dad died. Someday I'm going to wake up and I'm going to feel just like I felt then. That's what I wanted. And what I was waiting for is to go back in the past, to return everything back to that place. That's what I was clinging to. And once I got in hospice, I realized, no, a momentous event in your life, like someone you love dying, that's meant to change everything, not to push you back into where you were in the past. It's meant to change everything. And that part of the reason I was suffering is that I was refusing to change. So going to hospice, that was my first big step toward allowing change to happen in my life. And then I realized, wow, this is going to change everything about me. And that's okay. That's what's meant to happen.
That is an amazing observation and an amazing story, because so many things you just said, like that's where you saw that love idea can be put into practice. And also what you just said is such an important thing to tell grieving people. And this is what I say all the time too, is you don't go back. There's, this is a cliche, but there's a new normal. And when you see people who are in the most pain, especially in complicated grief, that's a big part of the reason why, is because they want to go back to feeling the way they did before there was this big hole in their heart. And the hole has a purpose. As Rumi says, the wound is where the light gets in. And so to help people use that wound as a way to propel them forward is really what we're supposed to do with grief counseling. So you really said it beautifully about, the pain stays stagnant and hardened and absolute because you're trying to go back to your innocence before you were wounded.
Yes, exactly. Because in your mind, it seems like everything was fine then, and I want to be fine again. So I have to go backwards somehow. But I did come to realize. So I've had so many revelations, of course, through this entire process, all this time doing hospice work, processing my grief over my dad, but that the idea that my whole love theory got shattered by my dad's death, that was important too, because I honestly didn't understand before his death that sometimes love hurts and it breaks us apart. And that it was really, as you said, I almost had to have my heart broken in order to really love people so that the light could come in. I could truly love once that was broken open. And so then I saw, wow, everything that has happened has provided me with an opportunity to grow in ways I never expected, in ways I never could have imagined or could have sought out for myself.
A lot of people are really uncomfortable with this idea that everything happens for a reason, because it's been sort of hijacked by Christian evangelicals who are, I guess what they mean when they say everything happens for a reason is something like, God has a plan. But I believe that. And I just try to not say it in those words because it's become so sticky in the culture. So I like to say that everything has a purpose. Pain has a purpose. It's really true that, because the only option is that everything happens for no reason. Your father just killed himself. So what? There's no reason. It's just a random, meaningless event. That can't possibly be true in any universe.
Yeah. I agree with you completely. And I look at that, everything happens and it's up to us to find the meaning within it. And it isn't that, it was predestined that my dad would kill himself and then I would go to hospice. It's no, these are things that happened on this journey of life. And millions of other things could have happened, but these are the things that did happen. And then has been my job to figure out, given what has happened, how do I create meaning out of this? How do I find the most meaning and the most possible growth and the most love in everything that has happened? So for me, to myself, I always have that thought. Everything happens for a reason. Like, oh, I got a flat tire on the side of the road. Oh, well, there's some reason why that happened. That's fine. I'll deal with it. But I agree with you. You can't say that these days. It has, the meaning of it is too distorted in many groups.
Yeah, it's gotten too commercialized. It's too pop spirituality. So we have to find another way to say it. But what you're saying is, I mean, humans have a natural instinct to attach meaning to things, which is why we created religious structures and religious doctrines. And the thing is that we do attach our meaning. So we could just have these random events, and we can decide if we want them to mean something or not. And one of the ways we do that, this is an exercise that I give in my grief workshops, is you draw a line, a timeline, and you mark across this line all your losses. Like when I was 3, my father left, and when I was 6, my grandmother died, and so on. And then I got divorced, and my dog died, and my mother died. Here's your timeline. And then next to every one of those marks that you put on the line for a loss, you put another mark of what did that transform for you. It's called the grief and growth timeline. So my father left when I was 3, but then my mother got married again and brought in a really good stepfather, and I was able to grow up with a father. Or then, my dog died, but then I went and got another dog in another town, and while I was there getting that dog, I met my next husband, or whatever. Everything turns into something else. That's what it means, that everything happens for a reason. Everybody bumps into each other in intersections of moments, like a pinball machine, right? You bump into one thing and you boing over there and bounce over there, and that's how it works. It's kind of wonderful.
I love that. I love that timeline of yours. I think it's so important because we actually have to look for the growth, because it's possible for us to ignore the fact and not see that we've grown from an event. We have to have the mindset that we're willing to look for it and to review our lives and reflect upon things that have happened in order to see it. And otherwise we might fall into that despair of nothing happens for any reason. It's all random.
Well, that's why that timeline is such a useful tool. And the reason I developed it is because somebody told me they had gone to a grief workshop where the attendees were told to make a timeline of their losses and nothing else. And so she tells me about this, and I said, well, then what did you do with it? And she said, well, nothing. They just wanted us to map out all our losses. And I said, and then what did you do with it? And she said, nothing. There was no process. There was no ceremony. There was no conclusion. And I was so upset by that. I thought it was such a bad approach. So that's when I came up with the idea of adding the growth spurts. And then I added a third thing to it, which goes in between the loss and the growth. There's another thing in the middle, which is a decision you made. So your father leaves home and abandons the family, and you make a decision that men can't be trusted, right? Or your dog gets killed, and you make a decision that you probably should never have a dog again anyway, because they're messy and you have to take them for walks, and I don't really want a dog. That's a decision you made out of your grief. And so you put the decision into that timeline too. So it's the loss, the decision, and then the growth. It's a fascinating process.
Oh, I love that. I think that's just so helpful. And sometimes another thing besides not everything happens for a reason that I hear I think it's in this new grief movement in a way is, oh shoot, now I forgot what I was going to say.
It's probably another cliche, probably something from the prosperity gospel, or, the law of attraction of, think positive thoughts and you can manifest Anything?
Oh yeah. Oh, I know what it was though, that I actually read one person who said, it's okay if you don't grow from your grief. A lot of people will tell you that's a good thing, but it's fine. You don't have to grow if you don't want to. And I agree with validating people wherever they are, whatever your experience is right now. But to me, that seems wrongheaded as well. Like, why not just say people, it may not feel right now like you'll ever grow from this grief, but keep an open mind. Maybe someday your experience will change. That's what I think that's a good way to validate where people are now. But to just say, you don't have to grow. Don't let people tell you you should grow after your grief.
That sounds like something that, so this is one of the problems with social media, is everybody posts their ideas. Everybody thinks they're a grief expert. I came across something on Facebook once, a link to something that was called something like 65 things I wish I had known about grief. And it's this long list of absolutes, and it's full of horrible advice, like what you just said. You don't have to grow. No. Well, you don't have to allow growth to happen. I suppose you could choose that. Then you're going to be in complicated grief. It's going to go into your body and you're going to get depression and physical illness. Yeah, you got that choice. But some of those 65 things were some of the worst incorrect grief theories I've ever heard. Like one of them said, if you think it's going to hurt when your loved one dies, when it really happens, it's going to hurt 1,000,000 times more. That was one of them.
Wow.
And one of them said, happy events like birthdays and holidays will always be sad. I mean, it was like a handbook of complicated grief. And
Yes.
It's posted on some website. I have it marked somewhere. And the reason we get these ideas is because everybody thinks they're an expert. And there are a lot of people out there giving grief advice and acting as a counselor or a grief guide or a chapter leader for a grief group that have no training in grief theory or group dynamics or psychology or any of the things that you need. And there's a lot of really bad stuff being spread out there.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I'll share one more thing that I bristle at a little bit, but then I want to hear your story, Terri, and have you tell us, how you ended up doing what you're doing. But one other thing that people often say is, I read all these posts about what not to say to someone who's grieving. And my concern about that is, when I was grieving over my dad's death, most of the people in my life said nothing to me. They didn't come around. They didn't respond. They didn't help me. And honestly, I wouldn't have cared what they said. It wouldn't have mattered to me what they said if they had just shown up at my door and been there. So I worry when we tell people these are the wrong things you could do when someone's grieving. I worry that we're scaring people away. Like, oh, well, then I won't go. I won't call my friend. I won't go talk to them because I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't know how you respond.
Well, this is why we have to teach them what the right things are.
Yes.
Because there are wrong things. Somebody could have come up to you and said, well, your father's in hell because all suicides go to hell. People say that all the time, or they'll say, oh, Karen, I'm so sorry that your father's in hell and you'll never get to see him in the afterlife. They say it with like compassion, or all the usual things, like, oh, God needed another flower for his garden or something, So yeah, there are wrong things, but we need to teach people what the right things are. And the right things are to show up and not say anything at all.
Exactly.
Right? So the right thing is, here's what I would say. I would come to your house and say, would you like me to clean the bathroom for you? That's what I would say. Can I go run to the store and get you something? And I wouldn't even ask, what do you need or what can I do for you? Because you won't be able to answer that. You don't know what you need. So you just kind of walk in and you say, here, I brought some food. Give you the food, maybe walk in the kitchen and straighten up, and just don't give advice. Just listen. But that's so hard for people to do.
And don't feel that you have to try to say something that's going to soothe the other person, because for the griever, that nothing can soothe you in that moment anyway. Someone being there is far more soothing. Being there and saying nothing is more soothing than any words they could say.
And soothing is not even a thing. You don't want to soothe somebody because, as you just said, you can't. And I heard this said once really beautifully: reassurance devalues suffering. So if I'm going to reassure you, what I'm doing is trying to tell you not to suffer. Please, okay, Karen, your suffering makes me really uncomfortable. So I'm going to say all this stuff to make you stop suffering because I can't be with your suffering. That's what reassurance and soothing really is.
Yeah.
But how many people know how to just sit with another person's pain? We're not taught to do that in this culture at all. We're taught to run away from it and try to make it go away.
Exactly. If we can't think of something that would make it better, then we just have to run away because we don't have any other tools to use.
Yeah. So the options are make it better or run away, when in fact, there's a whole other set of options, which boils down to just be present with it. And that's what chaplains are trained to do, which is a whole different thing. This is what I tell my chaplaincy students, is that if you learn one thing from being in this program when you walk out of here, is that you learn the skill of just sitting, being present with somebody's pain.
That's interesting. That would be one of the most valuable things parents could teach their children from the time they're really little, is like, oh, this feels bad. Let's just sit here for a minute. Let's just sit here together for a minute in the quiet.
Yeah. I don't know. Then you got to wonder if a kid sees another kid get hurt and fall down on the playground, are they going to interpret that as I have to be indifferent.
Oh,
I shouldn't feel sad. I shouldn't do anything. I shouldn't run and tell the teacher. I'm going to just sit here and be present with the kid who fell off the slide.
That's true. Could backfire.
It's different with kids, I guess.
Yeah.
I love you. Will you tell your story, my favorite story of yours about your neighbor's kid? I love that. We got to put it in here because it's so cute.
Okay. So I became a full-time hospice doctor. During that time, we had 2 children. And so I raised them as a hospice doctor. My husband's also a doctor. So they had lots of medical talk going on in our household. And our kids knew from the time they were pretty little that I helped take care of people who were dying and would go visit them at their homes. And they kind of understood that was my work. But when our son was about 7, I would say 6 or 7 years old, he had a friend over to play with him one day. And while they were playing in our living room, I got a phone call from hospice, and it was telling me that one of our patients just died. And so my son and his friend kind of overheard me talking, and his friend said, what's going on with your mom? What happened? And my son said, oh, it's one of my mom's patients just died. It's no big deal. And his friend said, her patient died? My son said, yeah, all of her patients die. And his friend said, I am never going to your mom as my doctor.
Oh my gosh, kids are so amazing.
Yeah. So it was really cute that my son understood that. Like, for some reason, all of my patients died. And that was somehow a good thing. He didn't quite have all the pieces to put together. But
no. And of course, all of your patients don't die. Sometimes they actually get better and leave.
Occasionally,
hospice. Not often. And they die eventually, I guess. Yeah, I love that story so much. So,
well, Terri, I want to hear from you. I want you to tell us your story of, I don't know where you want to start either with your story, but how you ended up becoming all of these things that you are: chaplain, grief counselor, doctor of ministry.
This is so much fun, Karen. We're interviewing each other. So now you can interview me. So I got started in this because I had a child who was severely disabled and seriously ill for half his life. He was diagnosed when he was 10 and given 5 to 10 years to live. And he died when he was 16. And that was 15 years ago. That was in 2006. And so during those years, I had the experience of caregiving, of course, but I knew that he was going to die. And I had always been a mystical, spiritual person since I was 12. So as soon as he was diagnosed and I heard that he was going to die, in addition to all the normal human responses of shock and sadness and grief, I also had this other response that was like, wow, this is interesting. I wonder why this is now happening in our life plan together. So I had, in addition to all the normal stuff, I had curiosity and eagerness to understand and to learn. And so when the time came and he actually died, and I was sitting with him, he was the first person I ever saw died. He was 16 years old. It was such a mystical experience, just witnessing the process of, for lack of a better term, a soul separating from a body just closing down, and yet there's still something present. And I felt that so strongly during his actual death that I knew I wanted to be around that more.
That's so profound, Terri. And I love that you talked about facing this challenge with Danny with curiosity and already recognizing like there's something here. There will be something for me to learn or to experience or to grow from. Having that mindset, I can imagine that helped you hang in there and get through those years, which had to be really challenging.
You know, I have to give credit to Ram Dass for that, because one of the things in one of his books, I think it was Grist for the Mill, he talked about looking at tragedy by saying, interesting. Oh, cancer, interesting, which is how he lived his whole life and up to the end. And you know, he was such an inspiration to me all through the 70s that I think that really put that way of responding into my mind, because it was interesting. And it was interesting in an even bigger picture, like, why did this being, this little soul and this little body of my child come to me in this part of life, in this time in my life, to do this journey together? I also went back to, do you remember The Boy in the Bubble?
Yes.
So back in 1974, I was 21 years old. I was sitting in my friend's house watching TV, and there was this story about the boy in the bubble, who was this kid who had this immune deficiency, and he had to literally live in a little plastic room inside his house. And I remember at 21 years old looking at that thinking, and again, I was always a weird spiritual mystic kid, so I always thought everything this way. Why would a being choose that body to incarnate in? Who is in that body, and why would he choose to come here in that form? And I immediately heard the answer to the question, which is, well, he wanted to come here this time around and have no ego. So like no attachments to the physical body, to, sexual attractiveness and, all the things that the ego likes. So I thought, what an enlightened kid. Who is that being? And then when my son was diagnosed, I sort of saw him the same way. It's like, why did he come here and choose this? And so that does certainly help, with the loss of his physical presence, because that wasn't the only reason he was here, was to be physical. So after he died, just the numinous experience of being around somebody dying, I just wanted to get more of that. So I became a hospice volunteer. I moved across the country, long story short, and I was a hospice volunteer for about, 2 or 3 years. And I realized that the patients were having all these spiritual questions. Of course, they were end of life. And as a volunteer, I wasn't really allowed to have those conversations with them. And that's where I really wanted to go. And I very quickly learned that the only people who are really allowed to talk about spiritual things with the patients were the chaplains. So at 56 years old, I went to college. And I never went when I was young. And I started out as a freshman at 56 and got a bachelor's in religious studies because that's what you need. That helps with the chaplain. And then I did a bunch of internships at inpatient hospice facilities. Then I did a unit of CPE, which is also chaplaincy training. Then I did a master's in pastoral care and was a volunteer chaplain for 3 years. And at that point, I realized that I didn't actually want to be a chaplain. I wanted to be a teacher because I'm a better talker than a listener. So then I had to go back and get a doctorate so that I could teach, because that's what's expected to teach college these days. So here I am. I loved my education. I love teaching. And now I'm doing everything I want exactly the way I want it. It's kind of amazing. So I'm a PRN, very, very part-time chaplain. I only see a few patients a year, really, not that many. I'm just kind of on call when other chaplains are on vacation. And I teach at the Graduate Theological Union in the chaplaincy department. So I teach up and coming chaplains. So that's that. And along the way, I started the Afterlife Conference, which I have done for the past 11 years, and which is how I met you, Karen, as a speaker at the conference. And that has now become the conference on death, grief, and belief, because the focus of the conference changed over the years as my focus changed. And now, because of my background in theology, I'm really interested in people's religious beliefs and theological perspectives and how that impacts their experience of death and grief.
I'm really interested in that process of transitioning from the Afterlife Conference into death, grief, and belief, because I wonder if within that, the broader umbrella of the afterlife, if you saw things there that were not, sometimes toxic or needed to be addressed a little bit differently, and that's what caused you to shift.
Very astute observation, Dr. Karen. That's a really big part of it. And what caused me to shift is I started getting all these credentials, right? I got all these degrees. I got certified in trauma counseling, and I looked at the people who were coming through the Afterlife Conference, who were pitching me, who wanted to be speakers, and they didn't have any credentials. And they would say, I'm a grief support person. I'm a death awareness educator. And I would look at them and I'd say, what are your credentials? Where were you trained? And they said, well, nowhere. I just really, I'm really good at being with death. And, my mother died. Or I took a weekend workshop on home funerals, or I did a weekend training as a death doula. And to me, that's not enough. And I got kind of tired of that. Also, everybody's a shaman, everybody's a Reiki master, everybody's a medium. I got overwhelmed with all the street corner practitioners that were bombarding me to be part of the conference. And so I said, I want to be more academic. I want to be more professional. I want a different audience. I want my regular audience, which is grievers, and also people that are interested in interdimensional experiences like after-death communication. I'm still all about that. But I wanted to bring in a more professional mix. So, I got it set up so that I could now offer CE credits, and my speakers are now, people with professional histories and academic credentials to talk about these things. And I really kind of got tired of having mediums. 11 years of having mediums at the conference, I'm not dismissing them at all. But I kind of have moved beyond that myself. And I guess, the conference is following me where I go. I've had tons of readings with mediums. I know all the top mediums, and they're wonderful and they're excellent. But at a certain point, I didn't need that anymore. And I think that grieving people should be able to move on from that. You don't go get a reading with a medium every year, unless... And this is a big caveat, unless the medium is able to tell you where your loved one is now. So he died 5 years ago. I'm going to go to a medium and ask, what's he doing and where is he? Has he incarnated somewhere in the world? Where is he in the universe? And mediums can't really tell you that.
Mm.
And so I started to see a lot of limitations with that. I saw grieving people really relying too heavily on mediums to ease their pain. I saw a lot of spiritual bypassing with people not feeling their pain because they just over spiritualized everything and missed out on the human earthly side of the grief experience. So I was just ready to do something else. And biggest thing was really, I wanted to bring in the toxic religion piece of it, which was completely missing from the Afterlife Conference before. And toxic theology also exists in the New Age world just as much.
It's so true. And I think surrounding the idea of the afterlife in multiple ways, because there's toxic theology associated with religion and who goes to heaven, who goes to hell. And then also, as you were saying, toxicity on the other end of it with the New Age movement, not quite grasping the spiritual realm, the consciousness around us, and not utilizing it properly too, I think. So it seems like it was your own growth. Is the conference has grown and transformed as you've grown and transformed over time.
Yeah, the conference is totally a projection of me. I mean, it always has been. And one of the funny things about it, when I first started it, I wanted to get to know my heroes. So in 2009, 2010, whenever it was, I wanted to meet Raymond Moody and Bill Guggenheim and I can't remember his name. Anyway, Suzanne Northrup, the mediums, all these people. So I reached out to them and said, I have this conference, would you come speak at my conference? And they did. And so now, all these years later, all these people are my friends. I know them. And now I'm finding myself attracted to other heroes, other superstars in other fields. So at the Afterlife Conference in 2017, we had Bishop John Shelby Spong. And he really opened the door to that other world, to like theologians and religious scholars. And everybody loved him. Most of our audience had never heard of him before. And they were like, who's this priest up on the stage? What's he going to talk to us about? And by the time he was finished, he got 2 standing ovations. And people were saying, I've never seen anybody like this. I didn't know there were, bishops that said these sorts of things. So that kind of helped open the door too. I love Spong. He just died this year. Such a brilliant guy. So yeah, so the religious piece is so important. And in the New Age world, we have exactly the same theology using different language. And the language is think positive thoughts and you'll manifest and co-create with the universe whatever you want, your health and love and wealth. And if you don't have those things, if your life isn't working, you're doing something wrong because you're not thinking right. And how is that any different than God is punishing you because you did something that God didn't like? It's exactly the same thing.
Exactly. Oh, you're so right. And I'm sure you witnessed in your hospice work what I saw as well, that there were some patients who were comforted by their religious beliefs as they were facing the end of life. But I believe I saw more who were threatened and terrified by their religious beliefs because they were so afraid that when they died, they would go to hell. And it was a huge struggle for them at the end of life.
Yeah, that's what I noticed too. That's what got me onto this. And, my doctoral dissertation was called Toxic Theology as a Contributing Factor in Complicated Grief. I mean, I was seeing it all the time. So I'm kind of glad to hear you say that you also observed that with your patients all those years, that the people with traditional religious notions had more anxiety.
Yeah, and some of those patients that I spent time talking to expressed a feeling of almost being betrayed that they got sick. And they one man in particular said, I lived my life according to all of the rules and all of the religious laws I was taught. I never made a mistake. I never wavered. I did everything right. And now I end up with cancer. And it was this idea that if you do the right things, you'll get rewarded for it, which isn't how things work here. It's not how the universe works at all. But that is that way of thinking. I think that's even true. Well, actually, we had a new age patient, I would say. Also, similarly, she said, I was a vegan. I do yoga. I exercise every single day. I don't drink any alcohol. I take care of myself. And I end up with cancer. How is that right? I did all those things so I wouldn't get cancer. And it's like, but it doesn't work that way. That's not how it is.
And that's just the physical things that she was saying. The other new age thing is I thought the right thoughts. I didn't allow any negativity into my body. I said positive affirmations every day. I made a vision board of all the pictures of the things that I wanted, the handsome guy and the fancy car and the beach house, because that's the whole law of attraction thing. And what's, the book, The Secret, I think is one of the most spiritually damaging teachings that has ever come out, next to the notions of hell and punishment. It's the same thing, because people come up to me all the time and they say, I did all the things. I made the vision board and I didn't think negative thoughts. And what am I doing wrong? And to me, they're just as broken and suffering as the people who are afraid of going to hell, because they went to church and they tithed and they did all that and they're still sick. It's just a bad theology all the way around to think that there's, a system of input and output. I can't think of the word that I'm looking for, where, if you invest and you get a return on investment or something.
Or I think of just a vending machine. You put your money in and you get a treat back for it.
Yes.
And it just does, it doesn't work that way. What just popped into my head is that I was kind of thinking that way after my dad's death, but I know all about love. I have all these theories of love, and I studied this and I studied that, and I'm a doctor. Like, why couldn't I save my dad? And all of that thinking has to be shattered. And for me, it was probably essential that got blown away very early on. So I could become, like you were, more just curious about, this is what's happening now. I wonder why, or I wonder what will come of it. I wonder what can be made of it. Not there's a cause and effect for every single thing,
Yeah. And the law of attraction, there actually is a law of attraction, but it doesn't work like the vending machine. The law of attraction, if you're going to call it that, is when you come into this life, you bring to yourself whatever is going to move you further, So you attract a father who dies by suicide. Now, I don't know. Take that back. I'm not going to say attract. I hate that word, because that means that there's something you did, when you say you attract abusive boyfriends, you attract drama. I hate when I hear people say that, because it's so try to think of another way to say it. You create, and this was another thing that Ram Dass said, you create the painful situations, or the situations that will bring forth what you're here to learn. So let's say that instead of attract. There's a wonderful Ram Dass saying that goes something like that. I wish I could remember it. And so, we invite these things on a very subconscious level. Otherwise, do we really want to have a life where we never have any loss? Of course, it's not possible. Like, nobody ever dies. Nobody ever says an unkind word to us, Yet there are people, religious people, who feel that that's possible because they're protected by faith. Mm-hmm. And those are the people right now who are not vaccinated against COVID.
And those are the people I saw in hospice who get shattered one day when they do get sick and something challenging does happen to them that they weren't expecting, that doesn't fit with their belief system.
So there's two things that can happen when that happens. So that's a crisis of faith, right? And I deal with people struggling with that all the time. And so you have two choices. You can cling to the old way of thinking, to the old rules and system of faith and then be angry at God or angry at the system because it didn't work. And you can still cling and fight and try to put that square peg in a round hole forever, and it's never going to fit. Or you can give it up and let it go. So you know what? That belief system obviously wasn't true. What I believed all my life since I was 3 years old, what they taught me, damn, now I'm 50 and I'm finding out that that wasn't true. And you can start reconstructing a new theology. And that's what the new conference is really about.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And when I apply that to like my process of dealing with my dad's suicide, when looking back at it now in retrospect, clearly like his suicide is what propelled me to shift my whole career from family practice to hospice. And I ended up writing a book and becoming a speaker and a teacher and doing a podcast all about death and dying and finding all this richness and spiritual wisdom that, that completely changed my life. And so, but would I ever say, oh, I'm so glad my dad died by suicide? No, I wouldn't say that, but I would say this profound meaning has come about after his death. And I can only express gratitude for the way life unfolds sometimes that we're not prepared for, we don't expect it, but things happen. And when we at least can be curious, like you were saying, and just go with the flow of it, we may be moving towards something, a change that's important that will help us in the future.
And even if we don't know, we never can know what that change is going to be until we get there. But looking at it the way you just described gives us peace along the way in the process. When people say to me, I'm so sorry that your son died, I say, you know what? It's okay. It was part of a bigger thing. And if this hadn't happened, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking to you on the Ask Dr. Death podcast right now, or doing any of the other things. I'm sure I wouldn't have gone to college and gotten this education, and I wouldn't be doing this work. So because of my son's death, I have a life that's more productive and more meaningful and contributes more to the culture than I would have had otherwise. Now, I don't know that for sure. I don't know what it would have been otherwise, but based on the rest of my life up to that point, I wasn't really doing much of anything special. So I think that it did contribute to me having something to offer the world that I wouldn't have before.
Oh, absolutely. And so as someone observing and getting a chance just to watch how you show up in the world and how you've worked, I can experience gratitude for where you are and what you're doing and what you're bringing to the world, because it's so important. I was just going to say the very conversation we've had about spiritual bypassing and also about toxic theology, I don't hear those happening very many places these days. I think it's so important.
Yeah, it's going to become a thing. It's because the statistics are showing that people are dropping out of religious structures like flies. It's the people who identify with a particular religious denomination or tradition, according to the last Pew and Gallup poll, drop about 1 point per year in the last 20 years, which is a lot. So yeah. So, the term toxic theology is going to come more into the language, and religious trauma syndrome is also something new that I hope that we will see in psychology, but we're only just now beginning to hear about it. Religious abuse, people who were raised in really strict religious environments as children and kept away from the rest of the world, only allowed to play with other kids in the same religious community, not allowed to read outside materials, given, biblical literalism and strict codes to follow, et cetera. That ends up somebody who grew up with religious trauma. So there's so much to talk about. And thank you, Karen. And, same back to you, my friend. I mean, your work is so amazing. When we did the symposium this last weekend, all these people emailed me and said, I've been following Karen Wyatt for years. I'm so glad you had her on the symposium. Everything she says is so rich and so full of value. So I've gotten tons of wonderful compliments on your presentation at our symposium. And you're well known. You have a following. People just adore you. You're really good at what you're teaching.
Wow. It's nice to hear that every now and then, because one of the problems with podcasting is that you sit in your own home. Here we are, each in our own little studios recording, and you have no idea if anyone even listens. Will anyone even hear this? Will anyone even care that we did this? But so it's nice to get feedback.
We can look at our dashboard on our podcast thing. We can see how many people have listened, So we sort of know. But yeah, it's, we got to keep marketing. We have to keep putting this out. It's a lot of work. This is your retirement, and you're probably working just as much now as you did before.
Yeah, it's true. But I wanted to say, for you, the symposium that you just did, the success of that symposium is a real validation that this new path you're on is exactly what's needed right now. Your timing is perfect.
I was surprised how many people responded to that symposium. And most of them were like nurses and social workers and chaplains and psychologists. And the same with the Death, Grief, and Belief Facebook group. People are saying, oh my God, I've been looking for a place to talk about this. I've been thinking about this as a hospice nurse, but I can't really say it at work because nobody really talks about this. So yeah, I hope I've opened up a brand new door. We shall see.
Hey, Terri, since we mentioned the symposium, I don't know the answer to this. If someone is just now hearing about it who didn't get a chance to attend, could they still pay the fee and get access to the recordings of it now after the fact?
I hadn't thought about that, but I don't see why not. I'd have to charge the same fee because a lot of, otherwise it wouldn't be fair to the people who paid. But yeah, I should probably put that out there pretty soon and let people know the recordings are all there.
Just thinking now that we're singing the praises of it, I thought, someone listening might be, darn, I missed that. I wish I could get in on it.
So. All right, good idea. I could definitely do that. Okay, Karen, thank you. This is perfect. This has been just great. I just wanted our listeners, our millions and millions of listeners that we don't have, to get to know us a little bit. So I think this was perfect. They can hear us. They can't see us, which is good because this is audio only. Karen and I are both in our workout clothes, not camera ready. So
yeah,
we're glad that it's audio. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. And we'll see you next time on Ask Dr. Death.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Terri Daniel. And I do want to say one thing, as much as for me as a doctor and someone being highly trained, I value academic training and knowledge and learning. I also value experience as a teacher and wisdom as a teacher. And I will say that some of the most important lessons I've learned around grief and death and dying have come from people who were not academically trained. And so I wanted to add this as something I didn't say during my conversation with Terri, but I do believe that any one of us can be a teacher for someone when we share our own stories and when we tell people our path that we've been on and what we've learned. Primarily, if we don't assume that just because we've learned something that helped us grow, it's the answer for everyone else. If we're making that assumption, we're going a little too far out there, applying our own experience to everyone else. But if all we do is share with other people, this is what happened for me, and this is what worked or helped me, and we understand that everyone is different and unique. So my experience may be nothing like anyone else's experience. And it might be that me telling someone what happened for me or how I see it isn't helpful to them. And as long as we recognize that and we have a lot of sensitivity toward who we talk to and how we talk to them, but also our assumptions. We have to have humility. We have to know that we don't know everything. None of us do, even those of us who are highly trained and have lots of credentials and lots of letters after our names. We don't know everything. So I don't think you have to become an expert in everything around grief and death and dying and hospice care and the end of life. I think that you have to have some sort of wisdom, some basis of information and knowledge, and a huge amount of humility. And you also have to be willing to be an ongoing student and to keep learning, to keep adding tools to your toolkit, and to keep growing your own base of information if you want to go out in the world and help other people and teach other people. But as I've said, I don't think you have to have lots of degrees and credentials in order to do that. So there, I'm offering you my opinion on that topic. And before we say goodbye, I mentioned the Grief Coach app, and I want to tell you a little bit more about that before we leave. Grief Coach is on a mission to make sure nobody ever has to grieve alone. And it's a really unique service that I haven't experienced before. A Grief Coach subscription is a secure, private, and easy way to get guidance and support after someone dies. You can sign up in minutes and you'll start getting text messages right away. Texts are written by grief experts and personalized based on your loss. And this is what I did. I signed up for Grief Coach, and I happened to sign up before the anniversary of my mother's death. And I got a really beautiful message on the date of my mom's death, of that anniversary, and also a number of messages surrounding that event with some suggestions of things I might do, but also just comforting comments, talking me through what's normal to experience on an anniversary like that. And it was extremely comforting several years after my mother's death to have someone reach out to me with just a little bit of contact and acknowledgement that this is a difficult day for me, because to be honest, there's no one in my life who remembers that date, who would connect with me on that day. So I found the Grief Coach app to be extremely comforting. And another thing that's really helpful with Grief Coach is if you have friends or family members who want to help support you in your grief, but they aren't sure how to do it, Grief Coach will also text them with customized tips and date reminders so that they will remember to show up for you, and they will remember to give you a call or ask if they can be helpful to you, or even just to check in and see how things are going. So for this Valentine's Day, the day that celebrates love, you can give yourself or someone else ongoing care and support after the death of a loved one through Grief Coach, and you can get all the details about it and get $10 off your subscription at grief.coach/EOLU. And that's my affiliate link. I became an affiliate because I'm so impressed with what Grief Coach is offering. So again, that's grief.coach/EOLU. And I want to remind you, if you enjoy this content, please remember to share it with someone else who might also benefit from listening in to End of Life University. And go to the platform wherever you happen to be listening. Be sure and subscribe or follow this podcast, and then leave a rating and review. That's extremely helpful for getting more eyes and ears on the End of Life University podcast. I also really appreciate hearing your comments and your recommendations for guests for me to interview on the podcast. So please feel free to keep reaching out to me at Karen@KarenWyattMD.com. So until next week, when I'll be back with another interview and a transcript, remember that we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you, and love every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.